Okay, so we're going to, in the spirit of allowing us time to have enough receptioning together and that we enjoyed this in-person gathering, we're going to get moving on this housing panel. We have decided as a group that we don't want introductions or very long introductions. That's right. We're completely off script. I will just say, my name is Jean Paulo. I had the pleasure from the Urban Democracy Lab. I had the pleasure of helping organize the gathering. And I also want to personally convey my appreciation to everyone who made the magic of today's event happen. I wanted to appreciate everyone who made the time to be with us today. And I wanted to appreciate my fellow panelists today for putting up with a very late night set of questions that I sent them to prepare for. And then I said, we're changing.
Prepare.
Yes. So, so we have John Whitlow from CUNY Law. We have Razmir Kirmani-Frey from Hester Street, Marika Diaz from Urban Justice Center, and Satish Nori from Just Fix. So our panel is on racial capitalism and housing, and the accent on our conversation today is going to be on the dismantling part of dismantling racial capitalism. Housing is an interesting issue for us to dig into. First, because there's lots of very exciting campaigns and movements and thinking about housing in racial capitalist terms today. But housing is also one of those domains where racial capitalism is actually very specifically concrete, from redlining to predatory lending to disinvestment. Racist projects have been often very explicit in housing. Racial capitalist logics are often very explicit and talked about very explicitly in housing. You know, Keeanga-Yamada Taylor talks about how housing turns race into profit. It's something realtors talk about very openly and very explicitly. And at the same time, the movements and organizations and mobilizations against it do talk about race and capitalism very explicitly as well. So we're going to dig into this, returning to the themes of the previous panels. And I'm going to start off asking John Whitlow, my friend, who has written about racial capitalism and housing. There's this very nice piece of his about premature death and COVID, where he lays out a lot of the issues at stake. So John, can you walk us through your understanding of racial capitalism and how it manifests in housing? What's specific about housing in your view? And how is talking about racial capitalism and housing different than just talking about capitalism and housing?
Thanks, Jean Paulo, for the question. I asked for softball questions. That didn't really come off like a softball question. And thanks also for engaging with the work. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Great, okay. And thanks to all of you for being here, especially those of you who've been here since noonish. It's wonderful to see you all. So I want to, I guess, start from the top by just elaborating on the premature death piece, because I imagine maybe that stood out, particularly for those of you who kind of haven't heard it in this context. It's drawn directly from Ruthie Gilmore's definition of racism, which I think is really incisive and incredibly useful. She defines racism, I'm going to see if I can do this without looking at my notes, as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Sort of a mouthful. And I used that concept or that way of thinking about racism in the piece that Jean Paulo referenced to think about who lived and who died, broadly speaking, when COVID hit New York City in the late winter and early spring of 2020. And I wanted to ground that exploration in the overwhelming power of the real estate industry in the city and in the city's neoliberal restructuring that took place in the 70s and 1980s. So I used to work as a housing attorney at an organization called Make the Road New York, which I think many of you are familiar with, and I know One of my co-panelists is a Make the Road alum, and there are other Make the Road alums in the room. It's an organization that does many things. It supports and advocates for working class immigrant New Yorkers. And in the late spring of 2020, so in May, so COVID had really already come through the city at that point. There was a vigil, a candlelight vigil held in Queens near the Make the Road office there to honor the memory of the 67 members of the organization who lost their lives due to COVID. And these are folks who hailed from various parts of Latin America. And, you know, I'm not going out on a limb to say that probably every single one of them worked a very hard job that they couldn't take off from, and lived amid substandard housing conditions in a neighborhood that had been subjected to austerity and disinvestment. And I'm sorry, Gianpaolo, you said to be punchy, and I feel like I just brought everything down a little bit. I'll do better. I'll try to do better.
These are horrible truths that Jason was inviting us to look at clearly, and you know, sometimes you got to punch at horrible things.
Yeah, it's true. So at the same time that happened, you know, we knew already that whiter and wealthier parts of the city had very low COVID mortality rates, and this got me thinking in a very acute way during a moment of deep crisis about something that I think I had really known, and probably most of us have known for a long time, which is that the conditions in which we live impact our health and our life chances, and that people are subjected to poor housing conditions on a racialized spectrum, and that all of this operates in a political economic context in which housing is a commodity that's a key source of investment and profitability. So Gianpaolo, you asked what's specific about housing, and I would say that, you know, and my focus, by the way, is on rental housing. So it's a little bit specific. You know, I would say the specificity around housing is that it functions as a commodity. It functions simultaneously as, you know, an asset, the value of which is going to be maximized by its owner, and then also as someone's home. And that, you know, that's a pretty unresolvable contradiction, particularly in a global city with an abundance of large corporate, often financialized landlords, like the Kushner, whatever Kushner calls his various LLCs that Christina referenced earlier. These landlords have the power to dictate prices and to shape public policy, and in the process to render life extremely difficult for working class people who can barely afford or can't afford to make ends meet. And so I guess just briefly to make sure we stay on topic, I want to say that it's important to view the process through which real estate capital moves into and invests in particular places as a process of racialized value extraction. We see this in the waves of gentrification that have hit New York City in recent decades. It's useful here to go back to the 1970s when the city went through a profound fiscal crisis that led to entire neighborhoods being starved of essential public services. And when many, it's true, it was really, really messed up. And when many residential buildings were basically abandoned by landlords. These were working class Black and brown neighborhoods like Bushwick and Bed-Stuy in the South Bronx, whose residents were essentially cast aside. And tragically, the fact that these neighborhoods were devalued in a heavily planned way, and I think that's a theme also that runs through the discussions we're having. They were devalued in one historical moment, and that devaluation functioned as a kind of magnet to attract real estate development that was boosted by tax incentives and the like in a later historical moment in a different economic climate. And I say tragic, you know, not just as a flourish, but because this process has led in many instances to the displacement of the same people and those people's children who had previously been abandoned when it was expedient to do so. Since we're in a law school, I should say too that I think, and I'm not going to talk about this at length, but you know, law has played a really substantial role in all of this. And in New York, you know, you can look at how the rent laws, the laws of rent regulation were essentially turned into Swiss cheese by our state legislature in the 90s and early 2000s, and how that essentially attracted capital to come in to invest in rent stabilized properties and force people out. So I guess to close on a bit of an optimistic note, and I think this is something that Marika is going to take up in her comments, there's something else that's particular to housing that I want to underscore, and that is that it is an important site of resistance within racial capitalism. When an institutional landlord buys up a building or a portfolio of buildings in a gentrifying place with the aim of extracting value, it necessarily agglomerates tenants who share a common enemy. And the kinds of organizing that emerge from this setting can be powerful and inspiring, and I think can prefigure a different kind of society, one in which our life chances are no longer circumscribed on racialized lines by capital.
Oh, thank you. Marika, do you have anything to add? How does the framing sit with you? And we'd be curious to hear about your work at the Urban Justice Center and how racial capitalism intersects with it.
Cool, thank you. It's good to see you all. So yes, I don't have anything to add. No, I do. So I got plenty to add, don't worry. I got something. Yeah, so, I mean, in terms of how I think about racial capitalism and housing, I think maybe share a very similar analysis. But maybe I'll just add, offer up a few more pieces just to sort of, add to sort of building out the picture. So John talked about the commodity form. I mean, I think that's obviously a very critical part. I think the other pieces, like when we're thinking about capitalism and housing, and in particular racial capitalism and housing, are really ideas around enclosure and accumulation, right? And that, sort of creating an ability for private actors who are trying to generate wealth and profit to capture public value and to capture publicly commonly created value, to capture the commons, right? To invade, to colonize, right? To enslave, like all of those things and the different modern incarnations of those things, right? So would be the other piece I would add. And then finally, I think kind of the wage labor system is really predicated on an inability for all of us to meet our subsistence needs, and therefore to require folks to form a sort of a labor class that is then exploitable and can also honestly meet our own subsistence needs by building things and making things and so forth, but yet have that all sold back to us for someone else to profit from, right? In the form of housing or in the form of other goods and things that we need. So, so when it comes to race and housing, I think, it's really all of these things are very much, the things we're talking about are structural, they're economic, but they're also ideological, right? And so I kind of break it down into a few key categories. I think of it in terms of extraction, right? And I think, in the previous panel, we were talking about our relations to land and how extractive those relations can be and our relations to each other. For me, the landlord-tenant relationship and the landlord relationship to land is primarily one of extraction. Landlords will tell you, and I'm in housing court a lot, so, I deal a lot with landlords and their attorneys. Mostly I get yelled at a lot by landlords and their attorneys. But, they'll tell you, I'm here, I provide housing for people. I'm in the business of providing housing, this service, this public good. They're not in the business of providing housing. As far as I'm concerned, it's incidental, right? What they're in the business of is profiting from having a monopoly on a non-replicable good, which is the land, right? And through that monopoly, they are able to then generate rents. And so the thing that they say they're in the business of doing is not what they're doing. And so for them, the tenant is really another part of that extraction, right? They're sort of incidental. So, it's kind of like the late, very great, still great, Stuart and Lind said, they're not trying to kill you, but they just don't care if you die, right? So they're not in the business necessarily of persecuting tenants because they are evil and, want tenants to die prematurely or to suffer. And yet they don't care, right? And part of that is built in and baked into the business model and baked into this sort of system that we have. Same with sort of, exclusion, segregation, right? And, I think the bit that we oftentimes forget about when we talk about segregation is the domination, right? In the places where people are segregated to. And then similarly, the exploitation and like, Keeanga-Yamada Taylor's idea of predatory inclusion, right? That's sort of like people are included in certain markets, but where they can then be very effectively exploited and predated upon. The disinvestment in investment cycles of gentrification, right? Which inherently is like a racialized project because it really relies on disinvestment to then generate massive amounts of profit, right? That's like the structure of the whole damn thing. And then finally, I would say like the final one I would talk about always is like disposability, right? Like the communities of color, the Black and brown folks are fundamentally disposable. And we see that in labor, we see that in housing, we see that in all kind of areas. And in housing, the way it plays out often is in terms of gentrification, right? It doesn't matter if you live here or not. It doesn't matter how much you put into this place. It doesn't matter that all of the wealth that is extractable from this place has been generated by you, right? You, in the face of all our disinvestment, have created this place that is now valuable. But we don't care. You can be elsewhere, right? And similarly with local unwanted uses, the siting of public housing near local unwanted uses, which is what we call things like sanitation stations, electrical stations, right? Like, so there's like a real sense of like disposability, right? And then I think the final piece that I would highlight is the role of the state, right? And the thing that is critical to understand is the role of the state in all of this, in enabling this extraction and wealth building through its policies, in being sort of complicit with these private actors or ignoring all of their abuses, right? In enforcing and coding capital, right, through laws. And I guess kind of using their monopoly on lawful violence to then, ensure evictions and the criminalization of homeless folks and, all of the things that we see around us. And so I guess like when I think about like what is the way that we address all of this from a sort of a lawyering and a movement lawyering and an organizing perspective, I think about it in terms of three things. And one is kind of, that we have this system that is daily reproducing suffering and harm for our people. And we cannot not tend to that suffering, right? We have to tend to that if we have any hope of working our way out of this, of building something. But then we also have to resist, right? And resist in ways that are fundamentally anti-capitalist, not in any which way. And then build, right? Build together. So for me, that's like kind of how I break it down. And if I think about the resistance piece of it, I think about different campaigns that we're involved in these days that kind of, I would sort of say, are characterized by campaigns and actions and things that build class solidarity, right? That are like movement building, that bring people together, that prioritize people over profit, which is kind of a fundamentally sort of flipping the logic of the system, that we're in, and sort of challenging that logic in really key ways. And then also challenging the state and its relationship to capital, right? And I think that's very different from like the usual thing that happens where we sort of engage in class struggle and push the state to like a different place of relative autonomy from capital and from the capitalist class, which is much more like a kind of dynamic of capitalism. Right? Like it's a dynamic of capitalism that we engage in class struggle and the state makes concessions and it shifts back and forth between, the working class and capital. Whereas I think maybe what I would sort of propose are kind of the kinds of actions and organizing that actually challenge that relationship between the state and expose that relationship between the state and capital in the first place, right? In a more fundamental way. And so some of that work, I think these days looks a lot like, anti-eviction work, right? Very sort of, I think kind of big interventions, but in some ways very small interventions, things like rights to counsel in different places where we're sort of saying, you don't just get to evict people in an unmitigated way. We are going to intervene. We're going to contest that terrain as much as that terrain is part of the capitalist system, like a place like Housing Court. We're not going to leave it uncontested, right? We're going to fight there. And then we're going to take that and use that to then build bigger fights, right? Campaigns like Cancel Rent, I think, did a great job of like challenging the logic that profit always prevails, that landlords get to profit under all circumstances, right? And it instead brought up the sort of, hold on a second, this is an investment. You made an investment in something. You don't get to profit all the time. And actually, there are certain circumstances under which you get nothing, right? You should get nothing. And so, so Cancel Rent, I think, was a great, we didn't win, but it was a great way of kind of, I think, exposing and shifting the discourse a little bit around kind of, that logic of extraction. Fights for like different kinds of eviction moratoria, basically saying let's carve out spaces where like it is not okay to evict people so that we can get to a place where it's never okay to evict people. Right. And so starting kind of, but to carve that out. And, all of the direct actions that people do around eviction blockades in courts, that kind of thing that is really like building kind of direct action and that kind of power. I think rent strikes is like another fundamental terrain. It happens at that building level that you're talking about, John, whether you've got like people in buildings coming together. I think we're seeing like a lot more rent strikes across portfolios and kind of engaging with capital on its terms of like how it is organizing itself and then working out ways to sort of come back with organizing strategies that kind of take that on, So I think rent strikes is like a key arena that's like, frankly, us lawyers, those of us that have been around for a while, really like put the kibosh on for a long time in a way that was really shitty and kind of really just irresponsible, to be honest, that we kind of didn't kind of really support that kind of radical strategy in the way that we should have, and in fact actually deterred tenants from undertaking that kind of thing for a long time with our risk aversion and our kind of loyalty mentalities. So I'm glad to see that tenants just went screw that and kind of moved forward, and we and now we're there, right? We got there. So so that's like a great thing, I think. And then the final one I would say is like a lot of the kind of campaign that's happening around the sweeps of homeless encampments, which is something out like the organization that I work for, we're very deeply involved in because we organize with homeless folks. That kind of sort of basically trying to stake out an argument for the commons again, right? That like if as the folks from RAP on the West Coast say, if everyone can't afford the rent, then they shouldn't fucking take out 10, right? Like that kind of, logic of like, where do you expect people to be? Right. And where do you expect people to be? And let's take back this idea of the commons, right? Let's take back this idea that and the commons is very different, I think, too, I should say, from like state-owned land and publicly owned state-owned land. It's the idea that there is common space that it belongs to all of us and that the state has no monopoly on that space, right? The people do. And so some of that campaign work, I think, is a very powerful way of resisting.
Oh, very nice.
Sorry if I went
No,
too
no. I mean, we're going to return to these, and it's interesting because this is in some ways at some tension with or in dialogue with some of the things we were talking about in the previous panel. So that's actually wonderful to have on the table. But let me turn to Satish. What do you have to add to this analysis of racial capitalism? And we'd be curious to hear about your work and how this intersects with your work as a lawyer for tenants, as a Just Fix.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? So not only do I have to follow Marika and John, but the world's cutest baby is like staring directly into my soul. So apologies if I'm incoherent. When I think of this topic, dismantling racial capitalism and its application to housing, I think of housing court. And we've referred to housing court a few times. And there's a couple of questions that keep kind of slapping me in the face about housing court. One is, where did it come from? And this happens to be the 50th anniversary of housing court. Has anyone ever been to housing court in this room other than those of us who've already talked about it? So it's a horrible place. And as Marika described, violence takes place there every single day. But you might be surprised to learn that housing court was created for tenants to address repairs. That's what the statute says. Now, the second question is, well, who benefits from housing court today? The answer is landlords. So how did we get from that place where housing court was created for tenants to get repairs made to a place where it's become an assembly line, a fast track to evictions? And then the third question that is kind of obvious is, can we fix this? Can we change it? Or is it a broken institution in which, we can't ever change? We should walk away. We should dismantle it from the outside. And if that's true, the question becomes, well, what about all of those people inside that are suffering daily? Like, what about their plight? How do we protect people who are facing eviction, who don't have their housing conditions addressed, who are facing harassment, who are illegally evicted, if we can't go inside housing court, if we, back off of it? And so I left the practice of tenant defense. I did it for 20 years alongside these wonderful people. And during that time, I probably represented close to 1,000 families. And I can honestly say, I never lost a case. I came in second many times. It's a terrible joke.
Is this what passes for humor in law school?
These are the classics. So, but during that time, I kept wondering, as I saw people coming back again and again, owing rent that they couldn't afford to pay because the rent keeps going up and their salaries, their income doesn't match it. What are we doing here? Like, why do we prop up this system that's oppressive, that's violent, that takes this toll on people of color in New York City and other places? The other thing I learned is there's an information gap in these institutions, these racist institutions, between those who have power and money and privilege and those who lack those things. So how do we overcome those two things? How do we overcome the racist systems, and how do we rebalance the information gap? And so I left the practice of law to work at an organization called Just Fix, and we're a housing justice technology nonprofit, which are 4 words that don't belong in a sentence together. And so what we do is we try to tackle the systems problems. We try to make the systems that oppress people. Like, you can't even get into housing court without a proper document or understanding the rules. And so we try to simplify those things. And the other thing we do is we try to make the information more fair. We try to rebalance the information gap. So anyone who lives in New York City or has ever lived in New York City and had a landlord, you can look up your landlord on our tool. It's called Who Owns What. You can do it right now. And you'll be able to see everything that there is to know in open data about that landlord. And so these are the 2 ways in which, like, I see this problem, which is like, how do we overcome the racist systems and how do we rebalance the information gap? And to me, the answer as to whether we do engage with these institutions is we have a moral obligation to. We can be the sword and the shield, right? We can be the sword and have organizing groups and campaigns tackle the larger issues of housing inequality, but we have to be the shield. We have to protect those who are suffering every day within these racist institutions. So I'll stop there.
Well, very nice. Razmia, what do you bring in terms of analysis of racial capitalism? I mean, I want to hear about your work either at Hester or especially maybe even with some of your previous employment in
Sure.
having to do with public housing.
Yeah. So first, I want to admit something that I'm very different from my panelists. I'm not a lawyer. So just want to put that out there, and they're leaving and now they're done. So I don't have much more to add to the definition of racial capitalism, but I want to talk about public housing. And for those who know me, I always want to talk about public housing. So to do that, I want to talk a little bit about my career and then and talk about kind of maybe 4 things: narrative, value, who and what is valued and how, by whom, exclusion from the movement, from the affordable housing movement often, and then kind of what are we doing about it and what are people doing about it. And I'm an inherently positive, joyful person. And I think probably a lot of us are. It's what it takes to do a lot of the work. I've been I guess like an organizer in Brooklyn for, I cannot believe it, about 30 years, which is impossible because I'm like 25. So I don't know how that works, but I spent about a decade, a part of that period, running a community-based organization in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and running it with a Brownsville resident named Greg Jackson, or Jacko, who passed away probably like, I guess 7 or 8 years ago now, and was invited by Jacko. I can tell you that my interview with him went like this. It's just because it's like hilarious. I walked into the room. He used to, if you want to know, Greg Jackson used to play for the Knicks, the Suns. He's a point guard. If you know basketball, he's a point guard in every way he lived his life. And I walked into the room and he stood up and he looked at me and he laughed. And I didn't know what to do. Like, I've never had a job interview like that, right? Like initially. And so I just went up and I hugged him. I didn't know what to do. You laugh at me, I'm gonna hug you. So I hugged him and he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you're from Brownsville." And that was it. We worked together for 10 years. And we built an organization, and at the end, and I won't talk about that. I'm happy to talk about that all day, all night, all the time. But it became clear at the end of those 10 years, and Greg had died, that it was time for me to leave and other people to lead, which I think is another lesson. I'm not from Brownsville. I'm not Black. It's time for me, beyond time for me to leave. And who is next and who is coming in? Then I did the remarkable, shocked me, shocked everyone thing, and I went to work for the New York City Housing Authority. And it was really important and really shocking. And I asked permission, I will tell you, of like my friends who I consider family in Brownsville who live in public housing. I asked permission. I said, "Will you still trust me if I go work for the Housing Authority?" And if they had said no, I would not have gone. Period. I'm still very connected to Brownsville. My kid plays for the Mobetta Jaguars Football League out of Brownsville. I'm there all the time. I live down the block. So, but they overwhelmingly said, "Can you please go find out what the fuck is going on 99.9% of the time?" And I said, excuse my language, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. But I went and it was,
This was supposed to be a no cursing panel.
oh God.
Sorry, I've already, like, I feel like.
This is the NYU Law School.
That was not part of your midnight prep session. I went, and quite honestly, and I stayed for 5 years, and I got into a lot of trouble, like good trouble. What does it mean to, and I ran the Office of Public-Private Partnerships, and while I was there, I founded an organization called the Fund for Public Housing, which still exists. But it became clear after like 4.5 years that I'd hit the ceiling on like innovation, at least what I felt how I could work with residents to innovate within government. But God, I learned so much. Working then within NYCHA, I think it's important to say, and a lot of what I learned, which I'd learned some of in Brownsville, was like, man, how outside and siloed public housing was then. I think it's making progress now in the social housing movement, outside and not invited into the affordable housing movement. Right? So I would go to meetings about affordable housing, and I'm paraphrasing and being cheeky, but it would feel like people would be like, "Oh, wait, what are you doing here? This is about affordable housing, not about public housing." And it became so clear to me that in a lot of ways, that separation existed at every level. So government felt that way. Organizing and organizers felt that way. Communities felt that way. Things are not going to change. Talk about collective change if that is true, if that remains true. So when I talk about value and what I had to, developed, and with public housing residents, how do you develop, what is the narrative? And would ask New Yorkers of any kind all the time, particularly as we look at institutions and racialized institutions, how many people value public libraries? Hands would go up. Who values, you can put your hands up. We could do this. We do it right now. Who values public libraries? I have a kid, so I can say this, I love kids, even if you hate kids. Who values good public education? Yes. Good public works, good public art, right? And then I would ask audiences, who values public housing? Now this is a different crowd, so you can't. And every hand would go up and I would say, you are lying. Okay, we do not value public housing the way we value other public resources and institutions. Why? Let's ask the very uncomfortable question about why, because when we lean into discomfort, we're probably, and people get super sweaty and like weird, we're probably getting closer to some kind of truth. And let's talk about that. We don't value public housing because we don't value public housing residents. We don't value public housing residents because they are Black and brown, mostly in New York City. Like, let's get real about it. You want to talk about a racialized system that feeds a racialized, oppressive, white supremacist narrative, right? So, but like 1 in 14 New Yorkers lives in public housing. Like, think about that. 1 in 14, you're on a bus. 1 in 4, it's like a lot of people. And not only that, but, and this may not be true right this second, so don't quote me. This was true a few years ago, but the top 3 employers of public housing residents, the NYPD, the Department of Education, and NYCHA itself. The top 9 out of 10 are all the public systems that make this city run. So if NYCHA goes away, it's disinvested in, guess what? The political economy of New York City collapses. That's not like some line. That's actually true. So who tells what narrative and what is considered the dominant narrative, and how I want to connect that to, because we know that so often in racialized systems, the dominant narrative is not created by the people who are living that oppression. It's created by other people, just like research and data can be extractive. Stories are extractive, narratives are extractive. And so I can't quite remember what I was going to say next. I'll make it up. Give me 1 second. Right. So what I have heard time and time and again from public housing residents across the country, and this leads to mobilization and campaigns, and is that public housing residents don't feel connected to each other across the country through a powerful narrative that will create change and topple the racialized system. It does not mean that they want public housing to go away. But where is this powerful connective narrative that can engage with a policy narrative, policy conversations, think tanks? Where is that? And I think it's so when people say narrative, it's easy, it's not easy, but often it's kind of said at the back end, right? Or like narratives is seen as like a big fancy word. It's not. It's identity, it's everything. And I think, yeah, so why don't I stop there? I'll just continue. So.
Oh, thank you. No, we have, so when we were putting together this conference, one of the tensions, Andrew mentioned this when he was facilitating the first panel, we talked about this tension between winnable, necessary campaigns and those things which we see as dismantling racial capitalism. And how do we square that tension, if it really is one, or is it just a matter of sword and shield? I would like to hear from you all on this question, because we actually have a number of different kinds of proposals on the table. We have improving the information, we have rent strikes, we have improving, saving public housing as part of a social housing campaign, if I can.
Sure.
And we have the tenant unions, for example, so how do you all think of this question about winnable versus dismantling, or do you see that as a tension? I'll start with Marika, because maybe you don't agree.
I was just going into my pondering mode.
No, I knew it.
You were sort of going to start with someone else. Again, I'm going to try not to curse too.
No, it's
I feel
fine.
like we've all set a bad tone. No, I started it.
No,
Okay.
this is my first
Yes,
time.
you did. Yes, you did.
Okay, so yeah, good question. I mean, I think one of the challenges with that question, and I think it kind of, I don't know, maybe it sets us up badly, right?
Yeah, no, this is what I'm wondering.
It kind of sets us up badly, because we sort of end up in this place where we're trying to sort of work out, we're sort of like, I guess I find it a little bit navel gazing, to be honest, like a little bit sort of, it's great to analyze what we're doing. right? And obviously we have to analyze what we're doing. We have to be strategic. We have to know where we're going. We have to know how the things we do are getting us where we're going. So I'm not sort of an advocate for sort of scattershot, like, let's just do whatever, just punching wildly. No, but at the same time, I think that there's something about that dichotomy that has maybe become a little unhelpful to us, because it means we're kind of oftentimes engaging in this exercise of categorization, as opposed to sort of strategizing, if that makes sense. And so, like I know, and one of the things that I do find difficult about it is that we live in, I think it's fair to say, like, not particularly revolutionary times, right? Like, I don't know that kind of, not to disparage our panel at New York Law School, but like, I don't know that we're breaking down the barricades like here at New York Law School, right? So I think, what ends up happening is we're kind of having these conversations where we're going, is this sort of a reformist kind of, set of activities, or is this like a revolutionary set of activities? But what has come to sort of in our minds be the sort of the revolutionary thing, we don't really have a way of grasping at that, or we haven't built enough to really kind of be embarking on that. And we aren't necessarily in a place. And so I do think there's like a thing for me where I kind of wonder, like, do you get to talk about reformist and non-reformist things when there is no non-reformist things actually happening, like when we're not actually there yet, right? And I think that's like a bit of a challenge, right? Because I do think we need to build, I do think we need to dismantle, but I feel like we need to be real about where we are also, and not be sort of, you know what I mean? Like misstating where we are. And so if we're not in a revolutionary place, like if we're not in a dismantling place, then we need to know that about, and know that that's where we stand, so that we can actually be trying to get there, as opposed to maybe kind of thinking we're there. Right. So I don't want to be too esoteric about it, but I think that's like something that comes up for me with this question. Having said that, I think, for me, the categories like that I articulated earlier kind of really are the categories that I tend to work with, right? Like, are we tending to the suffering? And if we're tending to the suffering, we're doing it in a way that is contributing to the ability to build. Maybe we can't build right now, right? Like maybe we're not there, or maybe we're not there where we can like overthrow, but like, are we kind of working in that direction? Right? Like, as opposed to working in the opposite direction or stagnating, so I think that's like one piece of it. And then that, I feel like I don't know, it feels like a weird moment where I remember being like that nobody would say anti-capitalist, right? Nobody would say capitalism, for God's sake. Like there was a time when you couldn't say capitalism, right? And so to be in that place feels very like it feels good, but it feels also unsettling, to be honest. And like I think there's something about this moment where we have to kind of interrogate that a little bit to sort of see like, okay, so is the resistance that we're doing actually anti-capitalist, or are we just using that rhetoric and then still engaging in kind of the same kinds of systemic interventions, that we've always engaged in, which could be harmful, I think, right? To sort of co-opt that rhetoric in that way, or co-opt that language in that way. So I don't know, there's some thoughts. I feel like I was a bit inarticulate because you didn't give me time to ponder.
No.
I feel like I could have done better if I'd pondered, but I'll hand it over
Blame
to someone else.
I'm a teacher. I always know when people are mid thoughts, and that's actually John.
Yeah, I've got a number of thoughts swirling around in my head. I think some of which were maybe animated by the opening discussion from earlier today, and maybe sort of generalizable, but also related to housing. And I promise I will land on a concrete housing proposal. But yeah, I'm thinking about something Lester said around, constructing, I guess, counter institutions that sort of are durable and operate along a long time horizon. And it just strikes me that, and he harkened back to the moment in the 1970s when the sort of like, New Deal coalition fragmented, and what came next. And what came next is what we're living in now still. And it just strikes me that, the neoliberals who organized for that project did so from a position of relative political and economic strength, even if their ideas were deeply unpopular. And their ideas were deeply unpopular, like in the 70s or in the 60s and 50s. And I raise that here because, in some ways, I think that underscores the profundity of the challenge we face, which is to construct counter institutions from a position of economic and political deprivation. And, you know, I don't want to throw a wet blanket on it. I mean, you know, walking in today, I saw the banner, like dismantling racial capitalism. And I was like, fuck, this is NYU Law School. Like, that is really crazy that we're like, I don't know, 5 years, to Marika's point, like 5 years ago, I don't think you would have seen that.
I'm 25 years old. I have no memory of those old times.
So, well, I'm 83 and you would not have seen it a few years ago, and probably for sure you wouldn't have seen it like 20, 30 years ago. But you know, I'm thinking about just the nature of that challenge, what it means to create durable countervailing institutions based on where we are. And, you know, I'm reminded, I'm going to get really obscure. I'm reminded of a line from an experimental Italian novelist named Nanni Bellestrini, who is infamous or famous for supposedly in the 70s fleeing the Italian state by skiing down the Alps from the Italian side to freedom on the Swiss side, even though he couldn't ski. And Nanni Bellestrini said in this novel, The Unseen, that the only weapon that poor people have in this world is the weapon of solidarity. And, you know, I think, and I've had this conversation with a couple of people in this room, that solidarity is, you know, I heard this when I said it, I heard people, there was like a sigh of recognition. And that's kind of a problem in a way, because I think we assume we know what it means. And maybe we assume that like you can just say it and it kind of operates almost like a magic amulet. And so I guess the question I have, I swear I'm getting to housing. I swear I'm getting to housing. The question I have is like, how do you know, how would you use law, for example, to help facilitate solidarity building in the housing space in a moment in time after which, or amid just like neoliberal deconstruction or dismantlement of multiracial working class organizing spaces over the span of the last 40 years? Like, how might we think about law and organizing in an intentional, specific way to do that? And, you know, one project that we've been working on in our clinic, and I think a couple of people in the room are working on as well, is a project that's intended to create collective bargaining structures for tenants, for tenant unions. Tenants could come together across buildings, across geographies, to negotiate with landlords around the terms and conditions of their living situations, but more importantly, to build power. And I wouldn't say I'm super optimistic about, like, not necessarily that project, but about the power building project generally. But I think it's something, and I'll maybe stop there and leave you with that, Gianpaolo.
Oh, thank you. Satish, what do you? So we have a couple of things on the table. So one, we're going beyond the rehash of the reformist revolutionary kind of thing, which the navel gazing organizers somehow brought it. It's fine. It's fine. It wasn't me.
It's been said on a couple.
Yeah. No, it's so fine.
You weren't.
And we've moved it into conditions of survival, about tending to harm, building power, solidarity. Where are you on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think hearkening back to the first panel, it's really about who's asking the question. And we can debate this all day long, have other panels, you know, just be paralyzed by this question, you know, going back to the navel gazing analogy. But to me, it's like the average person who's facing housing inequality wants their heat on. When am I going to get my heat on? You guys can debate this all day long, but if we don't answer that question, then we've lost. Like, there's nobody that we're here for. Like, what's the point? And so, you know, I think that's how Marika started answering the question, and that's where I would end it too.
Very nice. So, and before I turn to Razmir, I'm getting two separate messages on the time. Okay, so,
I'll be quick, I promise.
okay, yeah, so, and then we'll, after us, we'll give everyone a chance for a final word or
Sure.
two. So, and where are you on this question?
I'll be quick. I know I super wasn't before. So I think just to build off what everyone has said, but Marika, what you started with, I think the categories and categorizing within movements and organizing is really unhelpful. And where I see that in housing a lot is with and what it takes away from the potential power of movements and organizing, and turn on my heat. And it is the, NIMBY, YIMBY. When City Limits said now like SHIMBY, I was like, oh, shit, like, because people are going to run into those categories. And then we start again with the like siloing and people, you're 100% this, you're 100% that. I felt the same with the term social housing. So like 4 years ago when I was working on this idea and people literally would tell me I was out of my mind, like, how do you build a national social housing network, right? I'd heard from so many public housing residents, and nobody knew what it was. And now all of a sudden it's like everybody's talking about it. I was like, damn it, like it's gonna lose its power. So I think there is the names and the categories, and it's harmful sometimes. And then in terms of timing and cadence and holding, how do you hold both? Listen, we gotta turn people's heat on and fix the water, and my sink is backed up like today. That needs to be fixed today. And at the same time, hold the long arc of movement building, and then the mid arc of campaigns, and all of that. How do we do? I don't have an answer. I just want to say that like they're all important, but what is an emergency and what is emergent, and how are we defining that in building power?
Oh, very nice. Marika, do you want to have a last thought?
Oh, we'll all have a last thought.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You speak for all of us.
Bring us home. Bring us home.
Okay, go. I guess, maybe just to sort of, I don't want to take it in a different direction, but maybe just the thing that is coming to mind for me, I guess, is really the question of the role of the state and like, how do we break from the state? I feel like that is a piece of it that we maybe struggle with. So like when you were saying about like, how do we build institutions, right? I think one of the things that we struggle with is to build institutions that don't ultimately get co-opted or become, parlayed, become part of the architecture of racial capitalism, right? And so, and we've obviously, it's like a story as old as the hills, right? Like, it's, we see this time and again. And so it feels kind of a little bit arrogant to think that maybe we could build institutions that sort of are not subject to that cooptation and are not sort of, prone to that. And at the same time, it feels imperative that we must, right? And so I think that for me is kind of what comes up is like this question of the state and kind of having just great clarity and a very sharp analysis of the role of the state and how are we going to build in a way, because I think we can build. I feel like we know how to build. And I think we kind of, maybe in some ways also know how to sort of change, how to dismantle. But I feel like what we have failed to kind of grapple with is how do we do that in a way that is not subject to cooptation, where the things that we're building and to think generationally about that, right, too, because I think that's also one of the things we struggle with is that arc of history. And so how do we, build in a way, dismantle in a way that isn't going to just be sort of sublimated, just co-opted and become part of the next generation's kind of status quo of racial capitalism.
Satish, do you want to final thoughts?
I think we're standing between you guys and wine, right?
Yes.
So
No.
maybe, or coffee. More coffee. So yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Leslie, you want to say?
I think, systems of racial domination and racial capitalism affects kind of every single thing, right? Philanthropy. And so for me, I constantly think about and people may disagree with me, there are incredible number of organizations and communities that have worked so hard for housing justice and this sounds cliche, but it's true. They're fighting for the same dollars from philanthropy, which is in itself a system that is like actually racialized capitalism. So how do we build not just like alternative institutions that perhaps are not racialized? I don't know that. I mean, I'm an optimist. I think that's possible for sure. But how do we build a movement where people and institutions and organizations don't have to think about like, oh my God, what about me? What about us? From a dependence framework, can we actually build something where, to your generational, multi-generational, well, there's purpose at the center, actual purpose at the center, and that purpose gets checked and people agree, and it can be different from what your organization is doing individually, but we really have purpose at the center to blow everything up, like whatever that means, but purpose at the center and not like getting a handle on organizational ego. And that organizational ego is perpetuated by competition. How do we get away from that?
Very nice. So we've covered a lot today. Good luck to the closing plenary, because we're looking to you to solve all the questions that we're leaving. This has been a great panel because we're actually leaving with a number of open, complicated questions, but have taken us much farther throughout the hour. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone.